All right, I think we're going to get started. Welcome to the Oqtane Community Stand-Up. I'm going to explain a few or provide a few notes about the community stand-up before we get started. So we have an agenda today. As I mentioned, I'm going to just mention a few things about why we're introducing a community stand-up. In these meetings, we're going to talk about Oqtane releases, so provide some updates around the recent Oqtane releases. We usually cover any updates to modules or themes that are notable. If there's any notes about the Oqtane Marketplace, I usually provide updates around that as well. And then we'll have some time for general discussion. So as far as the community stand-up is concerned, this is essentially the evolution of the Oqtane core contributor meetings that we've been having since October of 2023. As time has went on and we've been having those monthly meetings, I realized that a lot of the content that I was presenting in those meetings was applicable not just to the core contributors, but to the general Oqtane community. And so that's why I've decided starting this month to basically make those meetings public and allow anyone that's a member of the Oqtane community to participate. So these meetings are going to continue on the schedule that they've been on for the last couple of years. That is the first Wednesday of every month from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Obviously, that time does not work for everyone, and so I'm going to make my best effort to ensure that these meetings are recorded and that the recordings are published as well so that people can view the recordings later. We're going to cover Oqtane release information related to the roadmap. If there are demonstrations of new features to be done, they'll be done in these meetings, and we'll have some time for Q&A. So like I mentioned, this is all a move away from sort of private approach that we've been following in the past to more of a public approach, which is intended to be more inclusive, obviously taking some inspiration from like the .NET community stand-ups, which have been going on for quite a number of years and seem to be very popular. The meeting notes have always been published on the Oqtane website, so www.oqtane.org in the blog, and I'll continue to provide notes related to these meetings in the blog going forward. With that, we'll just jump straight into the release updates. So the last release of Oqtane was Oqtane 6.1.5, and that was released on August 17th, so a couple of weeks ago. That release contained 46 pull requests, 98 commits, and those were done by 3 contributors who I've listed here. Obviously, anyone who makes contributions to the Oqtane repository will be noted in these meetings and always basically have been in prior meetings that when we've shared the release updates. The highlights for 6.1.5. The version of .NET, so the .NET SDK was updated to version 9.08. There was a security vulnerability, a medium vulnerability that had been reported previously for Image Sharp, which is one of the components, one of the dependencies that's included in Oqtane. And so that was updated to the latest version in 6.1.5. There was some enhancements done to the user management in Oqtane, so that you can basically choose between an active and deleted filter, because obviously there is the ability in Oqtane to have soft deleted users. And so with the deleted filter, you can quickly find those users, and by default, it shows active users. From a code perspective, this is more of a style item, meaning so previously in the framework, we generally had a separate folder where the interfaces for classes were basically outlined, and the implementation were in a separate folder. And so in 6.1.5, the interface and classes were actually put into the same file. It makes it a lot easier to navigate and find the information related to these classes and easier to maintain going forward, and actually just involves sort of less maintenance of additional assets, which are kind of unnecessary. So that was done in 615. That would largely be something that most people didn't notice unless you are monitoring kind of the core framework code base. Some additional migration methods were added. So when you're doing migrations using EF Core, sometimes you want to be able to seed data as part of that, or update data, or even remove data. And so there were some additional methods added to the migration classes to allow that to be done more simply. These are similar to methods that exist in EF Core, but they have some additional capabilities, which you can review if you take a look at the APIs for them. One of the big changes that was done in 615 is obviously Oqtane has supported multiple databases for a long time, since 2001. And when those were introduced as different database providers, they were physically separated into their own projects and NuGet packages to keep things very separated. And the idea was that, if you would only install a database provider if you were actually using a particular database in your installation. In fact, what ended up happening in reality is that it's a little bit more challenging to manage these dependencies, especially when you're doing upgrades, and especially when we've had major version upgrades, like from version .NET 6 to .NET 7 or .NET 7 to .NET 8 and so on. There were sometimes problems around these database providers because during upgrade, they would be loaded prior to upgrade logic occurring, and they're a fairly low-level dependency. And so because of that, it actually made more sense to merge them into the Oqtane.server project so that the dependencies can be managed as part of that project. And in fact, all of the database providers were being installed by default anyways to try and avoid some of these upgrade issues that had happened in the past. So this will just make it easier to manage them going forward. For the last couple of versions, the maintenance releases, we've been introducing time zone conversion capability to the framework so that dates that are stored in UTC time can be converted to a user's local time. In order to do that, we had to introduce a dependency on a library called NotaTime. And then there was just some issues related to that needed to be resolved. So that was fixed in 615. And then also some improvements to the initial installation experience related to database was also included in 615. So just a maintenance release with a number of items that were included. Of course, if you monitor the Oqtane repo in the pull request area, you can see a full list of all of the different items that were included in this release. So as far as the roadmap is concerned, the Oqtane 615 release was the most recent official release. That was on August 17th. The next release will be Oqtane 6.2, and that will be sometime this month in September. And that will be, I guess, I'm calling it a major release, and I'm going to describe why in a minute when we get into talking a little bit about what the features are in 6.2. And then following that, in November of this year, to coincide with .NET 10, will be the release of Oqtane 10, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. So Oqtane 6.2, so the next major release, which will be released this month. The main focus of this release has been on the developer experience. So for those people who are building applications based on Oqtane, there's been a major focus on this area over the last 2 to 3 weeks, looking at it from a different perspective. So if we look at things from a more architectural approach perspective of just basically how applications are developed today, on the left-hand side, we have a concept called modular monoliths, which have become quite popular over the last couple of years. The idea behind a modular monolith is that it offers a lot less complexity than what a microservice-based architecture offers. At the same time, it can offer a bit less flexibility. And when this image or this diagram is what it's trying to convey with modular monolith is that although it uses the term modular as part of the name, often the code as part of these so-called modules isn't very well separated from the rest of the monolith. Logically, there's some separation, but usually a developer hasn't gone fully through the exercise of what it would take if you wanted to fully abstract a module, to physically separate it from the rest of the monolith. Generally, it's sort of a logical separation. It's sort of separated, but not fully. Usually, the developer hasn't really thought through what the startup story might look like, the deployment story might look like if a particular module was completely separated from the rest of the monolith. So there is a lot of sort of tight coupling and tight dependencies in these so-called modular monoliths. If we look at the right-hand side of this diagram, that's of course the microservice-based approach. In this approach, there's a lot of flexibility because each so-called, I guess, module or mini application is installed in its own infrastructure, usually in containers. But as a result of that, then there's a lot of orchestration that needs to happen around the various environments, the different containers, and that adds a lot of complexity. Often that's like unneeded complexity, depending on what you're trying to build. Like, you shouldn't be spending all of your time trying to figure out infrastructure when you're just trying to build a basic application. And so the middle diagram here is what I've kind of referred to as an extensible monolith. It has some of the characteristics of a monolith and some of the characteristics of microservices. And this middle area here is what Oqtane has kind of been pursuing for quite a number of years now. And the idea with the extensible monolith is that the modules have been abstracted in such a way that they can be physically separated from the monolith, right? They're developed separately, they're maintained separately, and they're deployed separately into the monolith. And then at runtime, the monolith loads them, and it all becomes sort of one cohesive application story from that point forward. So this is kind of like the best of both worlds, and it's a model that I strongly believe in. And for those people that have kind of embraced this approach within Oqtane over the last 5 or 6 years, I'm sure that they would agree with me that there's some big rewards that can be achieved by using this model, right? You get a lot of flexibility, and you also have a lot less complexity than you would in the microservice world. The challenge with this extensible monolith approach, however, is that the Microsoft tooling doesn't naturally support this model. Like, Microsoft does not sort of provide great support for runtime extensibility, which is essentially what we're talking about in the extensible monolith. And so as a result of that, as a developer, you have to learn a lot more about how the environments behave, how .NET loads things. You have to do basically a lot more heavy lifting in order to be able to reap the rewards of this particular approach. And so because of that, I think it's kind of limited the number of people that might be able to take advantage of Oqtane. And so for a long time, I've been thinking maybe there's a different approach that could be utilized in Oqtane, that might align better with some of the standard Microsoft tooling. And so this comic that I found, basically, salmon swing up a river, are you sure that's worth the effort? For a lot of us, it's like, oh yeah, it's definitely worth it if you can get there. But for a lot of folks who are trying to kind of navigate their way through the application model that Oqtane supports around like true modular architecture, it's a bit challenging, and so they feel like they're fighting up this river maybe unnecessarily. And so with Oqtane 6.2, the idea was to take a very different approach to Oqtane development. And so some of the goals that we had as part of this Oqtane 6.2 release were, how could we provide a very fast installation for developers who are just getting started with the framework? Right? How could they set up their development environment very quickly? How could we improve the .NET tooling support, right? Utilizing the fundamental tools that .NET developers have become accustomed to, like NuGet and the command line interface. How can we do a better job with dependency management so that it aligns better with the .NET tooling? How can we support static assets like JavaScript files, CSS files, image files, and those types of assets? How can we simplify the deployment story? I mean, for those of us who are using the existing approaches, the deployment story is actually pretty simple, but it doesn't naturally align with the tooling, like the deployment capabilities that are, for example, part of Visual Studio. How can we do all of this while still allow people to leverage all of the capabilities that Oqtane offers today? And can we do this in a way that's backward compatible so that those people who like the current approach can continue to use it, while those folks who might like this new approach could use it? And I guess the last caveat here is, like, we were looking, as part of developing this approach, of course, there's different approaches for different groups of stakeholders. So those people who truly want to build extensions for Oqtane that they share with others and perhaps maybe commercialize and try to sell through the Oqtane marketplace, or even make available as open source solutions that can be installed into Oqtane installations. That is not the audience that this solution is for. This solution is for those people who want to build applications, usually for their business, and they want to leverage just the foundational capabilities that Oqtane has to offer. Right? They're not looking to share anything with the broader community, but they want to build a powerful application for themselves. So that's who this is intended for. So if we look at the architecture for a moment, what we have at the top here is sort of the traditional architectural approach that we've always taken when we're building Oqtane extensions, primarily Oqtane modules. So we would have a Blazor project. Well, actually, sort of at the top level here, we would actually use Oqtane itself, so the Oqtane framework, as the application host. So that means that we would have to, have a local version of the Oqtane application downloaded and installed locally on our local system. And then we would create modules. And those modules would be completely separated from the Oqtane framework, because you don't want to have tight coupling with the framework, right? They needs to be very loosely coupled in this kind of a model. And so you build your modules as Blazor Razor class libraries, and then there would be runtime references between your module and the Oqtane framework itself. And so what this means is that you would build your module, you'd compile it, and then you deploy it into the Oqtane environment. And then at runtime, when Oqtane, starts up, it would recognize that there were modules available in the environment, and it would load them dynamically at runtime to make them available in the environment. And so that's the way traditionally how Oqtane module development has worked. So instead of this approach, what we have looked at with Oqtane 6.2 is a completely different approach. And so in this approach, you're building an Oqtane application. And an Oqtane application can contain, multiple modules or multiple themes, or, take advantage of any of the different extensibility points that are part of Oqtane. The Oqtane application becomes the application host at this point, rather than the Oqtane framework itself. And you would have package references, so standard NuGet dependencies, between your Oqtane application and the Oqtane framework, right? You'd pull in the Oqtane framework as NuGet package references. And so this is a completely different model, basically inverts the model, turns it upside down. And this allows a lot of benefits when it comes to aligning with Microsoft tooling, as this architecture fits a lot more naturally with the way that the Microsoft tooling works. So first of all, I guess I wanted to mention that so there really weren't very many changes that were required to the core framework itself in order to accomplish this new application model. However, there was a lot of changes required to NuGet packaging. And so when you're developing locally and you are making changes to NuGet packages, obviously you need to be able to test those packages locally. So that means you don't want to be uploading like in-term versions of packages to NuGet itself. And so for most people, obviously this is something that you probably do regularly. But for those who are not aware of this, if you need to do a lot of testing when it comes to NuGet packages that you're creating yourself, in tools like Visual Studio, of course, you can create your own NuGet feed very simply, right? You basically just declare a folder on your local system, and you go into Visual Studio and you go into the NuGet management area, and you go into the package manager settings. And this dialog on the right is from that dialog box, right? And you click that little plus icon at the top right, and you specify the location where you're going to be putting your local NuGet packages. And that means that Visual Studio or VS Code or whatever IDE you're using will then, not just look at NuGet.org for packages, but it'll look in your local location as well. And so that makes it a lot easier to test NuGet package changes that you're making in your local environment. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is, of course, if you keep incrementing the version number of your NuGet packages, then the application that depends on those NuGet packages will be able to get the latest versions, no problem, even from your local NuGet feed. But if you do not change the version number and you're creating new versions of NuGet packages, you have to be aware that your local system has a NuGet cache, and that's usually stored in your users, like your Windows user folder with a .NuGet directory. And so all of the NuGet packages that you've ever installed are going to be in that NuGet packages folder, and they're stored by package ID. And then within the package ID, if you opened up those folders, you'd see that every single version that you've ever installed of those NuGet packages will be there too. And so if you create a new version of a NuGet package and you're using an existing version number, you often have to go into the NuGet cache and go into the specific directory and just delete that specific version directory. And by doing so, the next time that your application references that NuGet package with that version, it'll download it from the directory that you've declared as your local NuGet folder, and it'll put it back into the NuGet cache, the new version of it. So just some things to keep in mind when you're using NuGet that are quite helpful. So from an installation perspective, as I mentioned, the idea was to make it as simple as possible to spin up a new environment using Oqtane, right? And this is, again, using that Oqtane application model. And so we've created an Oqtane application template, which is essentially a NuGet package that can be installed using a standard CLI tooling. So, you can simply issue a command .NET new install and say Oqtane application template, and that'll download the template for you to your local system. And then once you want to use that template to create an application, you would say .NET new, and the name that we've chosen for this is an Oqtane app. And then you can specify basically tokens that'll be replaced during the scaffolding exercise. So, it'll personalize the application that you're creating with, usually it's like a namespace. So here I've got mycompany.myproject, and that would be used as a namespace. And that would actually be used also in the naming of the project files as well. And then once that application is scaffolded from the template, you can simply, go to that directory, build it, and run it. So this is like very simple steps to get up and running with Oqtane and building an Oqtane application. Much simpler than, I think, the steps we have today, where we actually ask you to clone the Oqtane repo, create a local, installation of the Oqtane source code, run the application, go to module management, use the default module template to create a module. This is definitely going to be simpler for people who want to build Oqtane applications. The Oqtane application template includes some example bits of code in it for like an example module and an example theme. Because like I said, like you're in this model, you're not creating an individual module or an individual theme. You're creating an application, and an Oqtane application can have many modules that are part of it, or many themes that are part of it. It's still important that, of course, this template takes advantage of all of the Oqtane capabilities that exist today. So it still supports all of the Blazor hosting models, so interactive, static, and render modes. And in terms of, so once you have created a new application, an Oqtane application using the template, it's still initially, once you run it, will throw you into the installation wizard where you can make the appropriate choices about the database you want to install and creating your initial user account. So all of that would be very familiar for those folks who have already used Oqtane before. I added a little note here because in the Oqtane 6.15 release, there was an initial version of the Oqtane application template, which was included, but it was very much still a work in progress, as it didn't support all the different scenarios that we wanted to support as part of the Oqtane like new capabilities. And the new template that will be part of 6.2 is completely different than what was included in 6.15. So this is just like a note that although that there was something available in 6.15, 6.2 is going to be completely different and support a lot more scenarios. From a development perspective, the idea was that, when you're building your Oqtane application, you can include multiple modules and themes. You can also, include some of the other capabilities that Oqtane has to offer. So you could include a scheduled job, maybe multiple scheduled jobs. You could include site templates. You can include basically any of the extensibility points that Oqtane has to offer. All of those could be implemented within the Oqtane application. And one of the huge benefits of using this approach is that you can finally use standard NuGet dependency management. So what this means is that, like what most .NET developers are familiar with, is when you want to pull in a dependency, you just reference a NuGet package, and that pulls it into your project. When you were creating Oqtane modules in the traditional way, because it was using sort of runtime dependency management, it couldn't utilize NuGet in the same way that the development tools from like traditional .NET development tools utilize it. And so that could create some complexity. This approach using an Oqtane application gets rid of that complexity, and you can use standard NuGet dependencies. And going even a little bit further with this, so it's one thing to be able to include NuGet dependencies. So for example, if you've got like a third-party component that you want to use, like a component maybe like image sharp, or like there's numerous, like of course, .NET third-party components that you might want to pull into your project. That's one thing. But another thing I wanted to explore was, would it be possible to actually allow native Oqtane extensions, meaning modules or themes, to be included into your Oqtane application as standard NuGet packages as well? So that was another area of research that was explored, and I'm happy to say that we were able to accomplish that as well. And then from a standard debugging perspective, of course, you want to be able to just F5 into your application. You want to be able to set breakpoints, all the standard debugging techniques that you're used to. Sometimes, like in the past, this has been a bit challenging with the traditional way of doing Oqtane development, but this Oqtane application approach is very well aligned with the tooling in .NET. And then from a deployment perspective, this question has come up many times in the past. Right? What if I, usually what .NET developers are familiar with is just, using the standard publish workflow that's part of an Oqtane, part of a .NET application, right? Where you just kind of right-click on a project and say publish. And because all the NuGet packages have been statically declared, it can pull in all the dependencies and build basically your entire sort of publish asset, which then you can just use the standard .NET tooling to publish to a folder, to publish to a website. Like there's numerous ways that you can publish. None of this was really possible in the traditional Oqtane module approach. There were alternate ways that you had to do deployment. And so with this Oqtane application approach, you can use the standard publishing workflow, which means that you can use all the other like ancillary tools that also support the standard .NET publishing workflow. Things like doing standard CI/CD deployments. And then when it comes to upgrading, usually what .NET developers have been familiar with in the past is if they want to upgrade to a newer version of a component, they would simply increment the version number of the package that's included in their project. And that would then pull down the latest version of that NuGet package, and then they would publish the new version out to whatever the environment was that they were using. So that was also not something that was really simple to do with the previous or the current Oqtane module development approach, and that is something that is possible with the Oqtane application approach. So with that, I'm going to show you some of this in action. So I'm going to go into Visual Studio to begin with, and so we can imagine that I've already used the Oqtane application template to create a new application called My Company, My Project 2. I'm not going to spin up a new one because there's some additional things that are already deployed into this application, which I want to be able to demonstrate without like spending a lot of like time and effort to do that. And so we have the standard set of, it's a standard Blazor project, of course. So we have the client project, the server project, and the shared project. If we look into the client project, we can see that it has the standard dependency. Like the client project has a dependency on the shared project. The server project has dependencies as well. But we can see here that it's using a standard package reference on the Oqtane.client project, right? So instead of having a project reference to Oqtane, we're using a package reference to Oqtane here. And this new version of the Oqtane.client package doesn't just include the Oqtane.client assemblies. It includes their dependencies as well. And that was one of the big changes that was required with NuGet packages in order to get this model to work. We can also see that I've pulled in a package reference to a third-party component called blazor.components.chart.js. So basically, this is just a Blazor component that's a wrapper around the chart.js JavaScript library. But I'm pulling it in just as a standard Blazor package reference, just like you would do in any .NET project. I also have a package reference to a native Oqtane module. And this Oqtane module basically just renders a chart, again, using chart.js. But it is, a standard Oqtane module, which is being pulled in as a standard NuGet reference. And so these are all kind of the capabilities that I was talking about. And so if we go into the modules area, so by default, the Oqtane application template has a folder called modules. It has a sample module called My Module. You can include as many of modules as you want in this folder, right? As long as they are separated they have their own unique folder name and their own unique namespace, right? So you can have as many different modules as you want in this folder. In this case, we only have the one. Similarly with themes, right? We have a My Theme, which is an example theme, but you can have as many different themes as you want, as long as they're separated by folders and they have the unique namespaces to separate them. Because basically, this will all be compiled into a single, My Company, My Project 2 client DLL. But the DLL itself can contain numerous different modules or themes that are part of it. And so that's how you can actually, build a very robust Oqtane application that has a lot of different types of functionality within the same project. And in fact, this is the way that the Oqtane framework itself is organized, right? There's a modules folder, there's an admin folder, and then there's a huge number of admin modules that are all part of the Oqtane framework. So this is exactly how Oqtane itself supports multiple modules from within a single Oqtane.client assembly. So if we go ahead and we run this application, it's already been installed previously, so we won't see the installation wizard. But we can see that chart.js module, which is a native Oqtane module, which was pulled in as a package assembly, or sorry, as a native NuGet package, installed properly and is fully running within my Oqtane environment, right? I can see it here in this list of available modules, right? I have a chart.js module, which just appeared in my control panel, but it was originally installed as a standard NuGet reference. So very powerful. And if I go to my page here, this was the my module, which was part of the application template, which was scaffolded for me from the Oqtane application template. I customized the module because by default, it just has this ability to, add, edit, delete, sort of a CRUD type of a module, right? To manage data that's stored in a unique database table. I wanted to, of course, pull in that third-party component, which was that Blazor wrapper around chart.js, and create kind of a random sort of chart using that component. And so this particular module, which I will show you here, is using just like, so the NuGet package was pulled in through the client project. Then I have all these using statements which say I want to use that particular component that I pulled in as a NuGet package. And then I am rendering the chart here, which is the standard chart component, because it's installed in my environment. And I had to reference the static assets that were part of that NuGet package using the standard Razor class library static asset approach, which is all static assets should be stored in an underscore content folder with the NuGet package ID. And then you can, you can organize the files beneath that however you want. But so it's pulling in this static asset, which is a JavaScript file, in the standard way. And of course, I had to do this because this NuGet package is being installed into Oqtane in the standard way. And so you can see how you can build an Oqtane application. You can pull in third-party dependencies in the standard way, like this, using a package reference. You can even pull in Oqtane modules that were native Oqtane modules, so long as they were packaged in the proper way, meaning that they are storing their static assets in that underscore content folder, and they're declaring their dependencies properly. And so I guess the next thing I wanted to show you is that if I wanted, what would be the story if I wanted to deploy this? So if I go into my server project and I say that I want to publish this application that I just built, I have a publish profile set up, and I'll say I want to publish it, and I'm publishing it to a folder. It's going to analyze all of the different NuGet package references that are part of my application, and it's going to pull them all together, figure out all of the dependency graphs, and then it's going to create basically a set of output into my folder, my publish folder, which contains my full application, right? So this would be the standard approach that any .NET developer uses to deploy an application, right? And so the build is complete, it published. If I go into my file system, I can see that this was part of my company, my project too. It's in the release folder and the publish folder, and I can gather up all of this output, right? I mean, even before that, we can see, let's see here. So here we go. silicon.module.chart.js.client.octane. This was one of my NuGet references to a native Oqtane module, and it was automatically pulled into my publish folder. Here's the reference to the chart.js component that I used, automatically pulled into my publish folder, right? So it figured out all of the dependencies of my application and pulled them into my publish folder for me automatically. I didn't have to do anything special. I don't need to know anything about how those NuGet packages work. I have a website folder here, and I'll just copy all of this output to this folder. The one thing I think I do want to change, though, is it probably kept my connection string from my other environment, which won't work here because it's referencing a specific directory, which it's not going to work. I'll just remove that temporarily. Save that. All right, so we've now deployed our application to an IIS site. So I'll bring up this site is referenced just using local host with no port number. So, and like I said before, so this is basically because there was no connection string, it treats this as a new installation. And so it wants me to specify what database I'm going to use. I'll just use whatever the default here is that it specified. I will now create my initial user account for this. And I'll use the standard default template, and I'll install. So this is a standard IIS install at this point. Okay, and I can log into this site. And let's see what's available. Oh, I can see that the module that I created, the chart.js module, that was actually pulled in through a NuGet reference, is available in my install list. And I could add this module to this page, and it works perfectly well in this new deployment that I've just done using the publish folder. So pretty powerful. Similarly, the other module that I had created, the My module, I could add that to the page as well. And there it is. And again, it figured out all of the dependencies that module had, pulled them into the publish folder. So standard publish workflow, and it works fine. All right, so with that, I'm going to go back to the presentation, or back to the slide deck. And so as you can see, so Oqtane 6.2 has like a lot of interesting capabilities around this notion of an Oqtane application, which definitely simplifies the development process, right? It makes it simpler to install Oqtane, create an application, pull in dependencies, and deploy. So I think that this is going to be kind of a game changer when it comes to people who want to utilize Oqtane, because you get all of the power of Oqtane with like multi-tenancy, modularity, all that capability, but a much simpler development experience. So the next release after 6.2, which will be sometime this month, will be Oqtane 10. And that is to coincide with the release of .NET 10, which is scheduled for release in the week of November 11th to 14th. What's important about .NET 10 is that it's a long-term support release, whereas .NET 9 was a short-term support release. So, of course, it's important to get on these long-term support releases as soon as possible. A decision was made probably 3 or 4 months ago that Oqtane's going to synchronize with the .NET major version number, starting with .NET 10. So we'll move from Oqtane 6 to Oqtane 10, and it'll just be easier for people to know, that if you're using Oqtane 10, you're running it on .NET 10, right? It just makes things a lot simpler. One of the main features that's included in .NET 10, which we were hoping to include in Oqtane 10, would be the .NET Identity Passkey support, which Microsoft introduced. Since Oqtane is often used as a sort of a Swiss Army knife of authentication, because it supports OIDC, OAuth 2, native sort of local auth story. We think that having passkey support is also important for that. There's also a number of bugs that were fixed in .NET 10, which Oqtane will be able to take advantage of, that I've mentioned here. The next thing I wanted to mention is like moving on from kind of the Oqtane framework itself. There's been a lot of feedback provided around the default text editor that's part of the Oqtane framework. Currently, it's based on an open source JavaScript editor called Quill.js. Quill.js is quite popular, but it's not a native HTML editor. It's a text editor, right? It allows you to do very basic text editing types activities. And there's a lot of people that want a more powerful experience, right? A more native HTML editor experience. And so Ben Zhang, who's like one of the big contributors to Oqtane over time, created a new text editor provider that is based on Radzen. And Radzen is, of course, a UI component provider. They have a real powerful set of UI components that are open source under the MIT license. And one of their components is an HTML, like rich text editor. And so that capability I'm going to demo as well. So with that, I'm going to go over to my Oqtane installation for a moment, and I'll run my Oqtane installation. I've already installed the Radzen text editor. If I log in, I can show you that in my site settings, in functionality, I have changed it from Quill.js to Radzen because I installed the Radzen text editor. And then if I go back to, like, for example, the home page, and I go into edit mode, and I go into edit content, this is the Radzen text editor experience. So it has, it's a native HTML editor. It's got a toolbar with a lot of like the rich editing functionality that's part of it. It has integration with the Oqtane file management capabilities so that you can, access the images and things and insert them into the content. It's got the ability to switch into HTML raw mode and back into the HTML editor. And it's also got a settings capability so that you can set the theme, and you can actually customize the toolbar and add or remove buttons from the toolbar as well. So Ben's done a really nice job of this. I am not going to embed this directly into the Oqtane framework at this point, because it has a fairly large dependency on the Radzen UI component library. But I think we're going to make this available as a free open source text editor provider that anyone can take advantage of. I think the one thing that we are going to want to do to the rich text editor provider is we're going to want to package it in a way so that it can take advantage of the new Oqtane application template approach, meaning you should be able to pull in a dependency to it just by saying, Oqtane.Radzen.rich text editor or whatever, and pull it in as a NuGet package dependency using a standard package reference. Right now, it's only installable as a more traditional Oqtane module, but with some minor changes, we can make it so that it is installable both ways. And I think that would be useful. Okay, and back to the slides again. So Oqtane Marketplace obviously is www.oqtane.net, and that's where there's a lot of powerful third-party extensions that are available for Oqtane, both open source and commercial. The original idea around the Oqtane Marketplace was it wanted to be more of an app store, meaning that when you have Oqtane installed, and of course I can demonstrate this, what I mean by app store. So if I go back to my Oqtane installation that's running, and I go into my admin dashboard, and I go into module management, and I go into install module, this is what I mean by the app store experience, right? It basically pulls in a list of all of the different modules that are available in the Oqtane Marketplace, and I can download them straight into my installation if I so desire, right? And they'll be installed immediately. So I can basically get immediate functionality into my installation. That's what I mean by an app store experience. So going back to the slides again, um, there is also a need to support more traditional purchase flows, meaning someone going directly to Oqtane.net, browsing the extensions that are there. Perhaps if there's a commercial extension, purchasing that commercial extension, then being able to download it and upload it into their Oqtane installation, right? That would be what I would deem to be a more traditional purchase flow. That's not an app store flow. And it would be important for Oqtane to be able to support both of those. And so there's a number of different refactorings that need to be done to the marketplace to accomplish that. So those changes have been worked on. They're not complete yet, but I expect that those will be deployed hopefully in September as well. And that ends, I guess, my list of items that I wanted to cover today. So I'm going to stop sharing this presentation so that I can view the chat. And so if anyone has questions, please go ahead and enter them into the chat, and I'll try to answer them. Question from Daniel Metler: can you still install modules in this type of Oqtane? Yes, yeah. So the whole goal with this new Oqtane application model is that it still supports the current methodology as well. So you can install modules either way. If you want to create a module that is installable in the traditional way and is installable as a NuGet package reference, there are some minor changes that you need to do to the packaging of your module, but they're not significant. It's basically just some changes to the new spec file, and placing your static assets in the underscore content folder and referencing them there. But yes, you can support both methods. Question: are script and style sheet new helpers around resource? They're not new. Those have been included probably for the last year, at least. So yeah, those were introduced, I think, probably a year ago. So instead of having to declare like new resource, you can declare new script or new style sheet. Yeah, so those helpers have been around for quite a while. Question: could we set the HTML editor via a site template? Yes, you can, because a site template allows you to, a site template is code, right? So a site template allows you to call any API method that's part of Oqtane. And not just that, right? You can manipulate the file system. You can talk to the database directly. You can do anything that you want in a site template. So basically, the site setting where it sets what the text editor provider is, which I showed you in the UI, that can be done programmatically as well by just, changing a setting value and storing it in the database by calling the API. All right. Any other questions? Question was, you mentioned that modules should be in a specific structure to be used as a NuGet package in application. Yes, it does, because, well, traditional modules, like modules that have been created up until this point in Oqtane, store their static assets in a different folder location than what NuGet expects. Like it stored them in a /module name folder. And so that is not compatible with the way that NuGet works. And so, yes, in order to use this new methodology, you have to change some aspects of the module. And I suppose I'll have to provide some documentation about how to do that. It's not like a significant amount of effort to do it, but yes, the traditional modules would have to be modified to be able to be installed as NuGet packages. And I realize like that this presentation probably is like it's exciting, but it's also a little bit scary for people who have been using Oqtane for 5 or 6 years, because they've become very accustomed to the way that Oqtane works and the way that modules are created and themes are created. Um, and this is a radical, very different way of looking at Oqtane development. And so it's going to take some time for people to get their head around it. This, like I said, this approach is going to be way better for those people who are building Oqtane applications, right? It's going to handle all their dependency management so much easier. It's going to handle deployment so much easier. It's going to get them up and running so much easier. But of course, those people who are getting started with Oqtane now don't have the baggage of how things were done previously. And I'm not going to call it baggage because, like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there are some distinct advantages to the way that Oqtane works today, right? Like if you really like that granular control, to be able to sort of just like one of the things I love with Oqtane today is I can have an Oqtane installation. I can make a small tweak to an individual module. I can compile it and I can deploy just those changes that are specific to my module, to my environment. I don't have to do a full-on deployment of the entire application every time, right? I can deploy only those things that are specific to that module, and that is really empowering. But yeah, there's definitely some pros and cons to either approach. All right. So, like I said, the recording from this meeting will be published. The next meeting, or the next community stand-up that we're going to have will be on Wednesday, October 1st. And that'll be at the same time, 12 to 1. And I appreciate everyone who was able to join today. Hope this was valuable, and looking forward to continuing on these community stand-ups going forward. I'm also looking for ideas on how to make these community stand-ups more interesting. So I think that similar to the way that the .NET community stand-up mentions interesting things that are happening around the .NET community, or even doing demos of perhaps things that other people have done in .NET. I think that this Oqtane community stand-up will evolve in that way as well. So definitely looking forward to this change and basically sharing this information more broadly with the Oqtane community. I don't know if we have a few more questions. I can see that people are typing. So I'll just wait a minute in case that there is a question. All right. Yeah, just some positive messaging that this new approach seems to be a direction that some people like. Question about the Radzen rich text editor. So it's just a matter, I guess, of getting this published appropriately. Right now it's in a private repo. So it needs to be made public. A NuGet package needs to be created. It needs to be distributed using the standard method. So there's just some work to be done to get it officially released. And like I mentioned, it won't be a default part of Oqtane, right? It'll be released as its own separate project, similar to the way that some of the other Oqtane modules are maintained, like the Oqtane blogs and things like that. All right. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate your time and look forward to speaking with you again next month.